Hey everyone, Pastor George here with today's Theolog, and today I wanted to talk about something that I came across on Twitter of all places. I know, shocking. It's like I'm always talking about Twitter, but that's like a great repository for content. It's just endless generation. And so this morning, as I was getting up in the morning and preparing for work today, I was scrolling Twitter as I always do, and this tweet came up, and I'll put it up on screen right now. And what this is so someone posted, what do people pretend is in the Bible but is absolutely not in the Bible, right? So things that are in the Bible that people think are there, or that they believe is in there, but it isn't actually. And these are always like really great in an ironic or not even ironic, I would say sarcastic, great in a sarcastic way, because it basically allows people just to air their grievances, right? And not understand the arguments that the church or that Christians have made about all sorts of things. So people were saying things like the Trinity, different social stances that the church takes that aren't mentioned explicitly in the Bible, but are obviously mentioned as bad or whatever. And so I hate this so much. And it's not a surprise that the person who wrote it had their MDiv from Union, and Union is a very, it's a Union seminary in New York, and to call it a seminary is to be very generous. Union Seminary is very much actually, something kind of related to that that I'm going to pull up. But Union Seminary is a bastion of, and I mean this not in the sense of political, although sometimes they can be related, but liberal Christianity. And so, or liberal religion in general. Maybe one day I'll do a live reaction, although I guess it isn't a reaction because I've seen it before, but a live walkthrough of one of their videos they put out a few years ago that was kind of like their admissions video, like Come to Union type, one of those type videos. And you guys can see for yourselves what type of seminary, quote unquote, Union is. And that's speaking as someone who went to Princeton. And the funny thing is Princeton is considered a very liberal seminary as well. And Union views Princeton as like this place of arch conservative thought, which it is not. If you wanted that, you would go to Dallas Theological or one of those types of schools, or the Masters Seminary. I don't actually think it's accredited in California where John MacArthur's at, right? So I think that, like, if we just are being honest about the spectrum, like, Union is a very liberal seminary in the sense that they don't take the Word of God as very serious, or as being literally the Word of God. It's much more kind of hippy-dippy in the way they view that type of thing. So anyway, he posted that, and so it's to his crowd, obviously, that this message got out. I'm sure if a conservative Christian did something like that, you would see all sorts of additional cringe takes coming from that end of the spectrum. But then we have this guy, Dan McClellan, and the only reason I've ever seen his name before, I've never heard of this guy. He's a PhD, he got from Exeter, and he's I'll get into that in a little bit because we'll talk about bias. But so he says monotheism, and the only reason I saw this is because I have a friend who is a PhD, a non-believer, secular guy who's a PhD in Germany studying the Bible, and he retweeted this, and so that's the reason I saw it pop up on my feed. And he says monotheism, right? That monotheism is in the Bible, and it got 632 likes, right? And that might surprise you that anyone would believe that monotheism isn't in the Bible, right? Well, if you step outside of the church and you go especially into the academic space, these types of thoughts are a lot more common. I mean, this is what I was taught in seminary and in my undergraduate. So this is stuff that I'm very familiar with. And so you might be thinking, well, why would someone believe that the Bible doesn't teach monotheism, right? We are Christians. We believe in one God, right? Jesus says there's one God. The church has always taught that there's one God. Then you have other religions that are based kind of out of the same branch, like Judaism and Islam, and they teach that there's one God. So why would anyone think that the Bible doesn't teach that there's one God? Well, because you have certain passages like Genesis 6 and 6:1, where it talks about the sons of God, which are the beings that come down, and impregnate human women, and they have a race of giants, and that's partially why the flood has to happen, right? And you also have stuff like Job, where Job talks about, hey, like the beginning of Job, when it's talking about the council, it's talking about the council of God and the sons of God in that council, and like these could be just other gods, is kind of some of the scholarly opinion on this type of thing. And of course you have the famous Old Testament commandment, right, which is thou shalt have no other God before me. Doesn't explicitly say that there aren't any other gods. It just says that Israel is not allowed to have any other gods besides Yahweh, right? And this is believed to come out linguistically, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, this person said monotheism, and a lot of people like that. But part of the thing, that one of the reasons that, again, and we're going to talk about bias because of course I'm bringing my own to this, but he's a scholar for the LDS, so that's the Latter-day Saints, and for the LDS, the Mormons, they are polytheists, so they believe that they'll become gods after they die. And that there are many gods, but you're only supposed to worship Heavenly Father, who is identified with the God of the Bible. And so you can see that having an opinion like that, besides kind of being a somewhat popular opinion in scholarly circles, is also the opinion of the LDS Church. And so it's very helpful, right? So, of course, you're going to look at the scholarship that agrees with you and say, hey, that's a good thing. And a lot of people who are also intertwined with that type of scholarship are going to like that type of thing. Now, does the Bible actually teach monotheism? That's going to be kind of my focus for this Theolog today. And I'm going to argue that yes, it does. I'm going to argue that it pretty clearly does, and that this is kind of a recent trend, because I view scholarship and PhDs and things like that as really being a knowledge factory more than anything else these days, especially in the liberal arts and humanities. There's very little. This is not me saying that this stuff isn't important, but there's a lot of pressure on PhDs and on scholars to just make new things up. This happens not just in biblical studies, but all other sorts of things. And so people are rewarded because that's how you get book deals, right? That's how you get tenure. You're rewarded for producing original scholarship. But, it's kind of hard to produce original scholarship if you're in a tradition that's 2,000 years old and has had these creeds and things that say, hey, this is what we believe about this type of stuff. You basically only can create original scholarship if you go against that. And so I think even the people who agree with that type of stuff would agree with me there that this is one of the problems in academics in general, in academia, is that you're required to create constantly new knowledge. So one of the phrases that one of my friends used is to call it a knowledge factory, right? Where it's just like you're making new things. But you don't really but making new things up, whether or not there's a lot of basis in it. And I'm most familiar with this within biblical studies and theology. But I'm sure if anyone has studied anything outside of that, you'll see it in other areas too. So I'm going to try and show that monotheism is taught in the Bible, and that it's pretty clear cut that it is taught. At least if you think rationally about it. But I think it would be unfair for me to, use sources that I would say are biased in my opinion, because obviously as a Christian, I'm coming at this with the intention to show that there's monotheism in it, and I'm going to read passages with that lens, and it's in my own self-interest to show that monotheism is in the Bible because that's what I believe, right? But I think that the best way to show this to people is to use the sources of the people that they find really helpful, or that has kind of started these things. So the first place I need to start at is to teach you guys how they even got to this place. And to talk about that, we have to talk about the documentary hypothesis. So the documentary hypothesis is a hypothesis, obviously, in the study of the Old Testament, specifically of the Torah, so the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And in those books, there was a scholar named Julius Wellhausen, who was from Germany in the 1800s, and he was looking at these books, and he was saying, man, I'm looking at this stuff, and the tradition that the church has taught, or that some parts of the church has taught, and the tradition of Jews is that all of these books were written by Moses. Actually, you see this in the New Testament, right? Jesus is, we've seen this already in our series on the Gospel of John. Jesus is speaking with the Pharisees, and the Pharisees are talking about how we follow the words and the laws of Moses, and Jesus says, didn't Moses write in his, isn't it written in the laws of Moses, right? That to see that the first 5 books of the Bible is written by Moses. Maybe that's what you guys were taught. Maybe you weren't taught that at all. I never thought about that as a kid. I mean, it's pretty inconsequential to the daily life of many people, so you're not really taught about these things a lot of the time. But for a long time, that was the belief of the church, and in fact, I have an old Swedish Bible that's from my family, and the first 5 books of the Bible in that are just simply called 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Moses book. They say it in Swedish. And so, like, right there, you see even in the translation and the naming of the books in the Bible, at least in that version, is tied in with this tradition, right? But you have curious parts of that where, like, Moses speaks about himself in the third person. If it is Moses is speaking about himself in the third person. He's speaking about events that he wasn't around for, so, stuff in Genesis and things like that. But also, there's stuff after he dies. And so the guy was looking at this, Wellhausen was looking at this, and he said, I don't think that Moses wrote this book. Here's my hypothesis of how this was done. And this was during a big explosion in biblical studies in Germany during the mid-19th century. You also had this with the New Testament as well, but that's a totally separate issue. Because most of this monotheism stuff is contentious in the Old Testament. The New Testament, no one at all has any contentious things to say about that, right? But in the Old Testament, it is a bit more contentious around this issue, or at least there's more division among scholars. So he basically said there were four different sources for what we call the Torah. That is the Yahwist. So someone who, and this is, he also looked at language differences, and he said, well, there are different parts that refer to God as different things, or emphasize different things and stuff like that. So there's the Yahwist, and those are the sections of the Old Testament, the Torah, that refer to God as Yahweh. There's the Elohist, who refers to God as Elohim. There's the priestly source, which is concerned with priestly matters, lineages, stuff like that, and then there's the rituals of the temple, stuff like that. And the fourth source is the Deuteronomist, and the Deuteronomist is basically what he believed was the latest source, and the person who kind of again restated some of the things, but made them, but he believed were more helpful for later editions of the Bible when it was being compiled. So that's the four source. I mean, I can't call it the four source hypothesis because that's also a New Testament thing, but that's the documentary hypothesis. Now, that was pretty much the running belief about how the Old Testament was written by scholars well into the 20th century. I mean, that's what I was taught. It was only in the late 20th century that this started to be challenged, and I wasn't really taught that much because it was really challenged in Europe, not in the United States. The United States scholarship generally still follows the documentary hypothesis, although that's changing quite a bit. And it went, well, actually, the people were actually, it really isn't clear cut that the differences between the Yahwist and the Elohist isn't really that major. There's no reason to believe that it's two different authors for that type of thing. And so scholars are I would say almost unanimous in the sense as secular scholars, but this includes Christian scholars as well, unanimous in the fact that the first 5 books of the Bible wasn't written just by one author. There probably were multiple hands in those books, but the debate is of the dating of these things and who did what, and if these are actually competing traditions are all part of the same one, with people just adding different things in, like you would have the Gospels, how the Gospels aren't different competing views of what Jesus is and who he is, but emphasize different things, right? So that's what this is. The whole point is just to show that it wasn't the belief is that this wasn't a one-time thing, and it was growing. So originally, Hebrews were polytheists, and over time, they became monotheists. And the Bible, quote unquote, shows that because God doesn't speak very strongly about monotheism, right? Okay, that's all the setup. I'm sorry I had to give you all that scholarship stuff, but that's where we have to begin if we actually want to tackle this thing. So, I'm going to use for today the New Oxford Annotated Bible, which is a New Revised Standard Version, which is a very much considered the standard version of scholars, a lot of scholarship outside of the NASB, which is also used, and is the one I used in both my undergraduate and seminary studies, and is like the favorite translation of liberal Christians and denominations. So like this, if you go to the Peace USA, our NIV in the pews is not what they use. They don't use the ESV. They don't use some of the more popular versions that Christians interact with on the daily basis. They use the NRSV. And it is a good translation. Obviously, like all translation, it has its biases, but it is a good translation nonetheless. And so we are going to start here our little thing with the Shema, and in this passage, right, we have a famous phrase that is brought. That the Jews, that is very popular in Judaism, and is still very important. But it's Deuteronomy 6:4, right? So it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone." Now sometimes they'll say the Lord is one, and so this is their. They have notes here as well, and so this is the note that they give for that. So they say the Lord alone. As text note A indicates, which is that the Hebrew is difficult, the translation selected makes the most sense historically. So they're saying this is a historical claim that they're making. The focus is not on God's nature in the abstract, not that he's alone God, but on the quality of Israel's relationship to God. The proclamation, like 5:7, which we'll get to, does not deny the existence of other gods, but is concerned with the exclusivity of Israel's loyalty to God. So this is here, they're saying the God alone, instead of God is the God, God is one, which is actually the more traditional way of translating this passage, is to say that, well, it's not, this isn't a statement, God isn't making a statement about whether or not other gods exist here. God is making a statement about his relationship with Israel. Now, I think that if this were the only text alone that we had, then that may be a very good argument. That could be it. But I think if we were to just look a little bit earlier in the book, we would see that this is not the case. But I do want to give them a little bit more power here. They want to refer back to the Ten Commandments, and so they just push us back to Deuteronomy 5:7. I'll read 6 as well. It says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." So again, with that, right, we have this idea that just because it says there are no other gods before me, it doesn't mean that there aren't multiple other gods. So let's look at 4:35, which is where I want to push us, and this is where I think that this kind of blows up the argument, because this shows that there was already a concept that God alone was God, right? So in Deuteronomy 4:35, again, this is NRSV. It says, "To you," this is speaking to the people of Israel, "to you it was shown so that you would acknowledge that the Lord is God. There is no other besides him." There is no other besides him, right? So the God alone is God. There is no other God beside him. That is what Deuteronomy 4:35 says. Now, the interesting thing is that what used to be the typical, I guess, counter-argument to this was to say, well, Deuteronomy is late. And therefore, we don't have to, that's a later tradition. Funnily enough, Now some of the scholarship with another hypothesis, which is called the supplemental hypothesis, I won't bore you with all these technical details, actually argues that Deuteronomy is the earliest of all of them. And this is just to show, and I have another good book here. This is Understanding the Old Testament. This is what I was assigned in seminary during my Old Testament courses. This is the 5th edition of it. This is a very scholarly book. It is not like an evangelical whatever. But it has this about the hypotheses, and just it's important to remember this. It says, keep in mind, this is what this says, keep in mind that this kind of source analysis is hypothetical and is being tested continually through scholarly study and debate. A vulnerable point in the old epic tradition, specifically the division of the narrative into Yahwistic and Elohistic strands and the dating of each. Some scholars maintain that the hypothesis stated this way puts too much emphasis on documents or sources and fails to do justice to the dynamic oral tradition that preceded and later accompanied writing. Others question the need to divide the old epic tradition into separate strands, suggesting instead that a single tradition was enriched or supplemented in the course of transmission. In the face of differing scholarly opinions, the proper response is not to throw up one's hands in despair. Rather, we should realize that the Torah is a very subtle and complex body of literature that challenges all of the heart, soul, and strength if one is to enter into its meaning. So, and then they're like, we're not going to talk about source criticism anymore. But I just think it's really funny. And so, just to show, even among, scholars, this is what usually people will say is they'll say the scholarly consensus is, I do this as well. We all do it. But consensus can mean 51%. It can mean 51-49, and really, if you were to take a circle of scholars and you could really divide them into smaller chunks, and it'd really be probably a plurality rather than even a strong majority, because again, knowledge factory. So everyone's going to want to carve out their own sliver and stuff like that. So the idea here, though, is that they'll point out these things, but they will not under-reference Deuteronomy 4. But funnily enough, when they get to Deuteronomy 4 in this translation here, they say this. They say, there is no other. This affirmation of full monotheism corresponds to the thought of the exilic second Isaiah. So they also divide Isaiah into a bunch of different parts. I'm not going to talk about that in this video. But you'll see there that basically the way they cover for themselves here is doing exactly what I told you they would do, which is say, oh, this was late. This probably wasn't originally part of the Torah. This is something that was added later. And I think that's really bad. I get it. It's inconvenient, especially if you take a secular kind of worldview, or if your system is built around a hypothesis that depends on that sort of thing. But I think that I think if you have to do that, that's a pretty weak argument. So the problem here is okay, well, sure, the Old Testament, at least in this one section, says that, hey, we teach monotheism. But what do you do about all that sons of God stuff, right? That's not an easy thing to get around. Well, I'm glad you asked. There's actually a lot of different places where that's used. So now the traditional understanding from Jews and Christians has been when it talks about the sons of God, for instance, in Psalm 29. This is the NIV, but it says, ascribe to the Lord, you heavenly beings, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. I read that because that's, I would say, the traditional reading of those verses, but I'm just going to get to them in our NRSV here. So Psalm 29:1 here says the same thing. It says, ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. But it marks, in the Hebrew, it says sons of God. So that's the same thing, Ben Elohim, I believe. I don't have my concordance or anything up in front of me, so that's just a massive shot in the dark, but probably something similar to that. So sons of God. And that's not the only place this occurs in the Psalms. This actually comes up several times. So in Psalm 82, it comes up as well. I'll read the NIV because I have that pulled up. But in Psalm 82, it says, you are God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. And so right there, right, you might have something like, oh, well, there it says that there are these other gods, right? In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment is how the NRSV translates that. Sorry, that's not Ben Elohim. That's just, I wanted to mark that because it's another place where you have this reference to other gods being made. And then in Psalm 89, you have here, sorry about that, 89:6, you say, for who in the skies above can compare with the Lord? Who is like the Lord among the heavenly beings? So just to get another reading of that so we can do our due diligence. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? And you have the same construction there, right? Sons of God, for heavenly beings. So we have that, right? All right. Well, how do we understand that? Because right now we have what looks like there's these other gods. Well, the traditional way of understanding it is, I guess you could say, the way that the NRSV and the ESV translate it for people who are going to read it, which is the heavenly beings. So that these are actually other celestial beings that are up there, like angels. And then that's kind of what it looks like in Job, right? Because Satan is counted among these beings up there, and that kind of follows in the tradition that has been understood and believed about what these passages meant, right? I mean, one of the big kind of thorns in the side of the tradition or the scholarly belief about these things is that there is no tradition outside of saying, hey, all of this refers to angels, not to other gods. Right? That's not what the Jews taught either in our earliest sources or through that, right? Everyone believed that this just referred to angels and things like that. Christians certainly believe that these referred to angels, and that has been the dominant and traditional belief of these people, and it's actually hard to find the other things. The only thing that people can land on is from the Bible itself. So having the Bible talk about how the Israelites fled to pagan gods and worshiped them, and archaeological evidence which shows the exact same thing, right? You have this idea that is talked about in the Bible where they mention you're going to flee to other gods and you're going to worship other gods besides me, and that's exactly what the archaeological record shows, that the Israelites did that. And so the idea here is that it's really convenient for people to believe this because, one, it shoots holes in Scripture. So if you don't want to listen to Scripture, it's a very easy way to deny it. But two, it helps prop up a theory that is kind of the dominant theory that is going on. And so if anyone wants to show anything that challenges that, it's hard. Now, you might think that I'm here to argue that Moses wrote the Torah. I'm actually not. I think that's a matter of faith. I do not think you are cheaper if you do not believe that, or more holy if you do. I think that a lot of the work that Julius Wellhausen did and a lot of these other guys can be valuable. I think the problem is that people end up realizing that they're just as temporally and spatially located as the rest of us, and that they didn't discover anything new. I mean, Jerome, who was doing a translation of the Bible in the 4th century, stated that he didn't believe that Moses wrote all parts of the Torah. There was a lot more diversity of thought among Christians about this issue, and I think that dividing it into you either believe this or you don't ends up leading to the same problem that we had also started around this time with fundamentalists and things like that, where it's either, and I've talked about this with my ARC thing, where either all of it's literally 100% exactly true in the way that we understand it now, or none of it is. And I think that we end up falling way too much into these traps, you know? I mean, on my shelves, I have stuff like this, International Critical Commentary, and one of the guys, I mean, it's kind of hard to see, but one of the guys here is Briggs. Briggs is the founder, or was one of the no, I don't think he's the founder. I don't remember the history exactly. He was one of the major early scholars at Union Theological Seminary. And so, you know, I have a variety of different sources on my shelves when I consult them for Bible study and stuff. And I personally find a lot of the arguments wanting. I see it as as people who maybe some of them are genuinely really interested in this stuff, but I also see a lot of people with chips on their shoulders, and I don't really find them very convincing at all. And I also see it as money's to be made, and there's good money to be a little bit incendiary and try and tear the Bible apart. So I get it. And I mean, I should spare just, I'm sorry, I know this is going on too long, but this is important stuff. I should spare just a few minutes to talk about some of these Psalms. So I just want to talk about Psalm 82 because I think this is interesting, and it rolls into our sermon where Jesus is this Sunday, where Jesus is actually going to quote this, and that will help illumine a little bit of what's going on, because I really won't have the time to talk about it then, or I'm going to be there forever. So in Psalm 82, it says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And then in verse 6, it says, I say, you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. And then it ends with saying, rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. Now, when you read that, it's like, well, God is speaking to these other beings and referring to them as gods, except he says, he kind of has this curious thing where he says, nevertheless, you shall die like mortals. So what is that talking about? Is it God speaking to these other gods that exist, that are also gods like him? No. And I think this is a really good example of how the Bible uses words that our translators do a wonderful job of bringing this up and showing this. But it also shows how difficult it is because it uses an analogy, it uses alliteration, it uses metaphor, it uses all these types of things. So this is as typical a standard or a clause that is talking about judges. So people in the government, right, who do not do a good job of judging their people. And you might ask, well, that's kind of a weird thing. But this is why he says in verse 6, right? So this is referring to judges of Israel, because this is a cry. This psalm is a cry for justice, right? It says, rise up, O God, and judge the earth, for all nations belong to you, which is actually a really radical monotheistic statement, because the going belief is that gods were for different nations at the time, right? So if you're going to say all gods or all nations belong to you, then, he's the only God. But that's besides the point. So he says he's speaking here to people who are in positions of authority, and that might seem weird, but actually in Exodus, God refers to the judges as in like priests that are going to judge over people as God. That's what he calls them, right? Because they're standing in the place for him. And so this Psalm 82 is a psalm saying these gods, people, you're going to be called gods. That's what God is telling them here, right? He says, I say you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. So you might think that because you hold this special religious place of being in judgment over these other people, you aren't going to actually be able to, you aren't better than them. People are going to call you gods, but you're not, right? I call you that in that, but that's not what you actually are, right? So it's a call, this psalm is a call to remind people that God is the ultimate judge and that judges themselves are going to be held responsible. But you wouldn't know that if you just read it, right? So if you're just some random kind of person and this is exposed, and hey, look, the Bible doesn't teach monotheism, you're going to go, oh, well, I guess so. But if you actually read it in context, like Jesus quoting this passage in John 10, right? He said, I say you are gods. He's speaking to the religious leaders and the Pharisees, right? Jesus is understanding Psalm 82 in light of the way that I read it. If he didn't understand it that way, and he was referring to other gods, then his use of it in John 10 makes no sense at all. So, and the problem is that people don't want to pay attention to the traditions that actually take this stuff and have commented on this stuff and have used this stuff for thousands of years, and instead just kind of rush into the arms of scholars because they like what they have to say about certain things. So I have no problem with scholarship. Again, I used it. I think it's helpful. I read their books. I have been inundated with their thought. A Pharisee of Pharisees is what you could really call me. I mean, I really, think that there's good things to learn. But at the end of the day, you have to do research on everything. You can't let other people do your thinking for you, and you have to test everything against Scripture and against their own presuppositions and authorities. So, yeah, I hope this has been helpful. I know that like this is 35 minutes long or whatever, and probably most of you have had no interest or little interest in this subject before, but I thought it would be a good place to start. I might teach a class on this type of stuff in the future if people are interested in it, because what ends up happening, especially with people who are raised in, I guess, in very fundamentalist circles, is they get out and they go to school, they go to a college or a seminary where they're taught this, and their faith kind of falls apart because they haven't been taught it already. And but they also haven't been taught that it has holes and it's not this rock solid theory. So, yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that. I just wanted to talk about that, lecture about it. And I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. I'll see you guys tomorrow for our Bible study recap, and Thursday for the mailbag. Peace out.